Organized crime has left many shadowy figures in history, but few as recognized and controversial as Pablo Escobar. His name not only symbolizes the rise of drug trafficking in Latin America, but also an era marked by violence, corruption, and fear. Escobar was accused of being behind thousands of murders, including those of public officials, judges, police officers, and civilians caught in his relentless war against the state. Despite the horror he sowed, Escobar managed to build an image that defied logic. While part of the country rejected him as a monster, another revered him as a savior. In the communes of Medellin, where the state was glaringly absent, Escobar was not just a drug trafficker. He was the one who paved streets, built houses, and distributed money among the poorest. That brutal contrast between executioner and benefactor exploded on the day of his death, and above all, at his funeral. This documentary will precisely reveal what really happened when the lifeless body of Colombia's most wanted man was buried. It was not an ordinary farewell. It was an event full of tension, with scenes that exceeded every expectation and left the country in shock. The 2nd of December, 1993, marked the end of an era. One day after his 44th birthday, Pablo Escobar died during a police operation in Medellin. The impact of his death was immediate and contradictory. While in the higher spheres of power, the end of a public enemy was celebrated, in the hillsides of Medellin, many mourned with true sadness. For them, Escobar was not just a criminal. He was the one who extended a hand when no one else did. That duality was reflected in the call for his burial. The family, aware of the bond Escobar maintained with thousands of people, decided not to restrict access. The funeral would not be a private act, but a ceremony open to anyone who wished to say goodbye. The gathering took place at a cemetery on the outskirts of Medellin. From early on, the crowd began to gather. Humble people, businessmen, politicians, even high-ranking government figures, including the president, attended that place charged with symbolism. The scene was as unusual as it was revealing. There lay the body of a man who had challenged the state, being farewelled by thousands of people who, for various reasons, felt the need to be present. Some wept, others just watched, but everyone knew they were witnessing a historic moment. How can one explain that a figure marked by violence brought together such a number of people? What led so many to walk behind a coffin that divided the country? And what happened when those who admired him came face to face with those who hated him? The answer lies in the images of the 3rd of December 1993, the day Pablo Escobar was buried. News of his funeral spread quickly, and with it, the city became the stage for an unprecedented social phenomenon. No one anticipated what was about to happen. The family, knowing that Escobar had as many detractors as followers, chose not to close the doors. It was not just a funeral ceremony, but the closing of a chapter that had marked an entire generation. The invitation was open, without restrictions, and the response was massive. From the early hours of the day, thousands of people began arriving at the Jardins Montesacro Cemetery, located on the outskirts of Medellin. Some carried flowers, others, photographs. Many brought nothing, only the desire to see for the last time the man who had forever changed the history of the country. Among the crowd were figures who, in another context, would never have coincided. Peasants, merchants, former allies, journalists, and also high-profile politicians. It was even reported that then-President César Gaviria, whose policies had been decisive in the downfall of the kingpin, was present. The scene was confusing, almost unreal. There, in the same space, grief, rage, nostalgia, and tension came together. Because not everyone was there to say farewell with affection. Many came to witness the end of the man who had challenged the state and spread fear for years. Others simply did not want to miss a moment they knew would enter the history books. To understand why thousands of people attended the funeral of one of the most feared criminals of the 20th century, it is necessary to go back in time. The answers are not only in the headlines or in judicial records. They are in his origins. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on the 1st of December 1949 in Rio Negro, Antioquia. He was the third of 7 siblings, the son of a farmer and a rural school teacher. His childhood unfolded in a modest environment, marked by austerity and a lack of opportunities. Shortly after his birth, the family moved to Envigado, a municipality near Medellín that would become his first training ground for the life that was to come. From a young age, Escobar showed intelligence and determination, but also a growing disdain for rules. Although his parents tried to provide him with a formal education, he dropped out of high school before turning 17. During the years outside the educational system, he found his true school in the streets. The rules of the neighborhood, forced loyalty, fear as a language, all of that shaped his character. With his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, his inseparable companion and future criminal partner, he tried to return to formal education after a while, but it was already too late. Their reputation preceded them. They were seen as troublemakers. Reintegration was a failure. Despite everything, Escobar did not completely abandon his aspirations. He forged a high school diploma and managed to enroll in university. His goal, to study criminal law and eventually make his way into the world of politics. His dream was ambitious: to one day become president of Colombia. But ambition alone does not pay the bills. The lack of resources cut short his academic and political plans, forcing him to abandon his university studies. Faced with poverty and the lack of opportunities, Escobar began to seek income through increasingly risky means. His first illicit business was as unusual as it was revealing. He stole tombstones from cemeteries and, after erasing the original inscriptions, resold them as new. It was his first approach to crime as a way of life. But that stage did not last long. Seduced by the logic of violence and quick power, Escobar became involved in more dangerous activities. He founded a small gang dedicated to kidnapping for extortion. One of their first targets was businessman Diego Echavarria, whose abduction ended in tragedy. Although the family paid the ransom, Escobar ordered his execution. From that point on, the group abandoned any attempt to operate within limits. Car thefts, arms trafficking, and smuggling marked their new routine. In 1974, Escobar was arrested for the first time. But far from halting his rise, that arrest only strengthened his decision to delve fully into the criminal world. Shortly thereafter, a new opportunity emerged on Colombia's criminal map: cocaine. In the mid-1970s, the country became an ideal platform for drug trafficking, given its proximity to coca leaf plantations in Peru and Bolivia. Demand in the United States was growing, and the routes were still under construction. Escobar immediately understood that this was not an ordinary business. It was an emerging industry that promised millions. It was then, according to various sources, that he decided to eliminate the man who dominated the local trafficking in Medellín, Fabio Restrepo. His murder, which occurred in 1975, allowed Escobar to take control of his operations. With Restrepo out of the way, Escobar inherited not only his roots and contacts, but also his position in the market. From that moment on, his structure began to consolidate, and with it, his fortune. The income grew, and with the money came a new stage in his personal life. In 1976, he married Maria Victoria Henao, a young woman of just 15 years old, 11 years younger than him. Shortly afterward, their 2 children were born, and Escobar began to project himself not only as a rising criminal, but also as the head of a family he intended to protect at all costs. That same year, his business vision expanded. Together with Carlos Leider and the Ochoa brothers, Juan David, Jorge Luis, and Fabio, he formed the group that would give rise to one of the most powerful criminal organizations of the 20th century, the Medellín Cartel. The strategy was clear and meticulous. They bought base paste in Peru and Bolivia, refined it in clandestine laboratories inside Colombia, and then sent the finished product to the United States, where the demand for cocaine was unstoppable. The routes multiplied, the transportation methods became more sophisticated, and the profits were counted in millions. For months, the cartel's operations developed under the radar of the authorities. Escobar moved large volumes of cocaine without major obstacles. However, that period of apparent impunity ended in May 1976. Upon returning from a negotiation in Ecuador, he was intercepted by the Colombian Administrative Department of Security. Inside his vehicle, hidden in the spare tire, agents found 39 kilos of cocaine. It was his first major clash with the state apparatus. But Escobar did not face the consequences like any other citizen. Instead of spending time in prison, he achieved the unthinkable, bribing not one but two different judges to release him along with his accomplices. It was a precise move, executed with money and power, that laid the foundations of his survival strategy. Shortly afterward, the DAS agent who had led his capture was murdered in cold blood. It was the beginning of a method that Escobar would perfect over time. If you could not be bought, you would be eliminated. From then on, his message was clear and brutal: corruption or death. That logic, which would later be known as silver or lead, became the axis of his empire. Silver was the reward for cooperating. Lead, the punishment for resisting. It didn't matter if you were a judge, police officer, journalist, or politician. Saying no meant becoming a target. As his criminal network grew stronger, his influence also extended into the political world. With enormous sums of money, he began to finance the campaigns of allied candidates, especially from the Liberal Party and Nuevo Liberalismo. The donations were not altruistic gestures but investments for the future. A way to weave a network of officials who, once in power, owed him favors. Drug money didn't just buy loyalty. It bought silence, impunity, and access. In this way, Escobar began to move through the country's institutions, as if they were extensions of his own organization. The political support and the network of influence that Escobar had built in the circles of power not only provided him with protection, but also gave him a strategic advantage to grow his business. With those alliances secured, the Medellin cartel was able to operate with a freedom that defied all logic in the years that followed. The turning point came in 1978. On an isolated farm, Escobar met with several of the country's top drug traffickers. It was there that plans were drawn up to professionalize the business, expand distribution routes, and turn what until then had been a fragmented operation into a multinational structure. In just a few months, the results were evident. By the end of that same year, the cartel had already introduced 19 tons of cocaine into U.S. territory. Demand kept growing, and Escobar, always pragmatic, understood that the next step was to optimize logistics. Until that point, many shipments were carried out through people, the so-called mules, or through insecure land shipments. But together with his partner, Carlos Leder, Escobar opted for a more ambitious route: the use of light aircraft adapted for smuggling. They chose a very specific model, the Cessna. Equipped with powerful engines, a large fuel capacity, and a flight range of more than 1,000 kilometers, this type of aircraft became the workhorse of the cartel. The first successful flight transported 250 kilos of cocaine, valued at more than $15 million. The operation was a resounding success. The use of airplanes not only reduced risks, but also increased efficiency. From that moment, Escobar decided to gradually abandon the human mule system and focus logistical efforts on a clandestine air fleet. With the airplanes already in operation, Escobar and his partners realized they needed an intermediate base that offered discretion, infrastructure, and proximity to the United States. That was how they identified a strategic point in the Caribbean, an island in the Bahamas known as Norman's Cay. Located southeast of Florida, the island was acquired by Robert Vesco, a fugitive financier and cartel collaborator. Together, they invested large sums of money to transform that remote paradise into a logistics operations center for drug trafficking. There they built a runway over 1 kilometer long, a private port, refrigerated warehouses, hangars, housing, and even a hotel for the exclusive use of the organization. Everything was designed for a single purpose: to receive cocaine shipments from Colombia, store them safely, and send them to U.S. soil with minimal exposure. Between 1978 and 1982, Norman's Cay became the main artery of Medellin cartel smuggling. Every weekend, Escobar and Carlos Leder flew over the Caribbean with planes loaded with between 300 and 500 kilos of cocaine. Once on the island, they organized the shipments to multiple destinations in the U.S., mainly in southern Florida. The profits were astronomical. In a short time, Escobar amassed such an enormous fortune that he decided to acquire 20 kilometers of land in the department of Antioquia. There he would build his symbol of power, Hacienda Nápoles. Inspired by Italian opulence, the complex was more than a residence. It was a private kingdom. It included artificial lakes, sculptures, a runway, a bull ring, and even a zoo with exotic species illegally imported. Hippos, giraffes, elephants, camels, and birds brought from different continents. Hacienda Nápoles was not just a display of power. It was a statement. Over time, his private zoo became an attraction in itself, visited by locals and maintained with a level of care worthy of a theme park. Everything was designed to impress. Escobar also collected cars, motorcycles, and airplanes. Some were unique pieces acquired out of whim. Others were logistical tools for cartel operations. Everything pointed to a double intention: to offer his family a life of unattainable luxuries and to keep the criminal empire that sustained his fortune running. By the mid-1982s, the Medellin cartel had reached a hegemonic position. Escobar controlled more than 80% of the cocaine that entered the United States illegally. The figures were colossal. Tons crossed the borders every week, generating revenues estimated at more than $400 million every week. The wealth he accumulated led him to appear on Forbes magazine's list of billionaires. At his peak, his fortune was calculated at $30 billion, placing him among the 10 richest people on the planet. That economic power also unleashed a new stage: the desire for public recognition. Escobar did not want to be just a powerful trafficker. He wanted to be accepted, admired. And to achieve this, he launched a personal campaign of philanthropy that changed his image in many popular sectors. In Medellin, he invested millions in community projects, paving streets, building schools, installing electrical grids, and sports centers. His most ambitious project was an alliance with the Urban Development Department to build 5,000 homes for homeless families. The initiative brought him even closer to the most forgotten neighborhoods of the city. It did not take long for a nickname to emerge that captured this contradiction: the Robin Hood Paisa. For many, Escobar was not a criminal, but the only one who did for them what the state had never done. Escobar's public image was strengthening rapidly. He was not only seen as a benefactor among the poorest sectors, but also admired as a generous employer. He paid those who worked in his laboratories salaries high enough for them to live with stability, a rarity at that time and in that context. As his acceptance grew, so did an old ambition he had never abandoned: to gain power through politics. Determined to legitimize his influence, he approached the Colombian Liberal Party, participated in campaign financing, and finally, in 1982, obtained a seat as an alternate congressman. Although his position was not a main one, it granted him significant privileges, parliamentary immunity, and a diplomatic passport that opened doors both inside and outside the country. For Escobar, this was more than a symbolic achievement. It was the validation that he could go from kingpin to statesman. But his time in politics was brief and turbulent. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, then Minister of Justice, began an investigation to expose his true origins. He soon publicly revealed Escobar's links to drug trafficking, forcing him to resign. Escobar never forgot that humiliation. Months later, Lara Bonilla was assassinated in an armed attack. Although the authorship was never judicially confirmed, many sources pointed to Escobar as the one responsible. The minister's death marked the end of his political adventure, but not of his influence. The latent threat of extradition would later lead him to confront another adversary, presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán. During the 1989 electoral campaign, Galán warned that if he won, he would extradite Escobar to the United States. That statement was a death sentence. Escobar interpreted it as a direct and unacceptable challenge. He wasted no time in reacting. He organized an assassination attempt during a rally in Medellin. An RPG rocket launcher was fired at the stage. Galán survived, but it was evident that the war against him had begun. That war soon reached its climax. Weeks after the failed attack, Luis Carlos Galán was assassinated at point-blank range during a political event in the city of Soacha. He was about to step onto the stage when a hitman infiltrated among the crowd shot him several times. The attacker was captured shortly afterward and confessed that he had received $100,000 to carry out the crime. The assassination of Galán was more than an act of violence. It was a declaration of war by Pablo Escobar against the Colombian state. From that moment on, his campaign to avoid extradition was no longer covert. His message was direct. He would not allow himself to be sent to a prison in the United States, no matter the cost. In the previous years, Escobar had already demonstrated his ability to corrupt or eliminate any figure who stood in his way: judges, prosecutors, police officers, ministers. But this time, the political and international pressure was too great. Bribes were no longer enough. Faced with the growing threat of capture and extradition, Escobar proposed a negotiation to the government. He offered to surrender voluntarily in exchange for two conditions: not being sent abroad and receiving special treatment during his imprisonment in Colombia. The answer was negative. It was then that Escobar went one step further. He founded a clandestine group called Los Extraditables, whose objective was to force the state to accept a no-extradition clause and, in addition, grant amnesty to drug traffickers who agreed to leave the business. It was a new kind of war, not only armed, but also political, propagandistic, and social. The group called itself Los Extraditables, and its slogan was as direct as it was chilling: "We prefer a tomb in Colombia to a cell in the United States." Under that motto, they launched a coordinated campaign to pressure the state on every possible front. The first step was through the media. They published statements in the country's main newspapers, attempting to present their cause as a patriotic defense. They argued that extradition violated national sovereignty and that they were victims of a foreign judicial system. Through these messages, they sought to legitimize their position before public opinion. But they did not stop there. They began to infiltrate political parties, finance campaigns, and seek allies within Congress. The objective was clear: to influence state decisions from within the system. For a moment, it seemed that this strategy was working. In 1986, the Supreme Court of Colombia declared the extradition treaty with the United States invalid, citing a legal technicality. It had been signed by a presidential delegation and not by the sitting president. For Escobar, it was a triumph. However, the celebration did not last. With the arrival of the new president, Virgilio Barco Vargas, the treaty was quickly reinstated. Diplomacy prevailed over criminal pressure. Faced with this setback, Los Extraditables changed tactics and became an openly terrorist organization. They declared war on the Colombian state and began to apply systematic violence against politicians, judges, journalists, and civilians. The turning point came in November 1989. Escobar ordered a bomb to be placed on Avianca Flight 203, with the objective of assassinating presidential candidate César Gaviria Trujillo. Gaviria did not board the plane, but 107 people died in the explosion, among them 2 U.S. citizens. 9 days later, terror struck again. This time, the target was the building of the Administrative Department of Security, DAS, in Bogotá. A car bomb exploded in front of the headquarters, leaving more than 50 dead and more than 2,000 injured. The attack marked the harshest point of Escobar's offensive. At that moment, there was no longer any doubt. Escobar had gone from being a kingpin to becoming the face of a terrorist group that justified the murder of innocents in order to avoid extradition. At the beginning of the 1992, state pressure reached a new level. The government of Cesar Gaviria launched an unprecedented offensive against the Medellin cartel, employing not only military and police resources, but also international diplomatic pressure. The noose was tightening. Faced with the real risk of being captured and extradited, Pablo Escobar chose to change strategy. In an unexpected turn, he offered to voluntarily surrender to the authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence and a special prison regime. But before his surrender was finalized, in June 1991, an event occurred that raised suspicions nationwide. The new Colombian constitution approved that same year included an article prohibiting the extradition of Colombian citizens to the United States. The timing sparked all kinds of theories. Many believed that Escobar and other drug traffickers had directly or indirectly influenced the drafting of that clause. With extradition off the table, the government allowed Escobar to build his own prison. Thus was born La Catedral, a prison complex located in a mountainous area, guarded by personnel chosen directly by him. But La Catedral was far from a prison in the traditional sense. It had a soccer field, a bar, a jacuzzi, a nightclub, an artificial waterfall, and even a dollhouse built for his daughter. Escobar ordered a telescope installed from which he could observe Medellin and talk to his family by phone. He had access to telephone lines, computers, fax machines, and all the means necessary to continue running his empire from inside. In no time, La Catedral stopped being a detention center and became an operations headquarters. Worse still, it also turned into a stage for executions. 2 of his associates were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered inside the facility, which provoked a strong reaction from the government. In July 1992, the authorities decided to transfer him to a conventional prison. But Escobar, with his usual information networks, learned of the plan before it could be executed. That information gave him the advantage. With enough time to act, Escobar set his escape plan in motion. He used an escape tunnel that he had ordered built during the construction of La Catedral. He had foreseen every detail, including a section of the wall made with weaker materials that he could easily break through. The escape was a direct blow to the credibility of the Colombian government. The shame was international. Immediately, the authorities launched a joint operation with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, to locate him. Thus began the final stage of Pablo Escobar's life, that of a permanent fugitive. During the following months, he hid in different parts of Medellin, always protected by a loyal network of informants. But his absence was felt in the cartel. Without clear leadership, arrests of mid-level commanders began, along with desertions and settling of scores. The most powerful criminal structure on the continent was starting to crumble. Escobar spent a total of 16 months on the run. To capture him, the government formed an elite group known as the Search Bloc, composed of agents specially trained for a single mission: to find him. For a long time, he managed to evade them. But his luck ran out on the 2nd of December 1993, one day after his 44th birthday. The authorities intercepted a call between Escobar and his son, and using triangulation technology, they located his position in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin. The operation was immediate. They surrounded the building where he was hiding. Escobar, together with his bodyguard, Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, alias El Limón, tried to escape across the rooftops, but the snipers were already in position. Within seconds, an exchange of gunfire took place. Escobar was hit by several bullets, one in the leg, another in the torso, and finally, a lethal shot that pierced his head at ear level. His body remained sprawled on the rooftop. Confirmation of his death sparked immediate celebrations among the members of the Search Bloc. They had achieved what seemed impossible, ending the life of the most feared drug trafficker in Colombia's recent history. However, what was initially presented as a clean operation soon became surrounded by contradictory versions. Who really killed Pablo Escobar? Was he gunned down by the police, or did he take his own life to avoid the humiliation of being captured? There are two key elements that fuel the doubt. First, Escobar had enemies everywhere at the time of his fall. Among them, a clandestine group known as Los Pepes, formed by victims and former rivals of the Kingpin, as well as by members of the Cali cartel. Their sole objective was to eliminate Escobar and erase all traces of the Medellín cartel. Second, there is the testimony of the Kingpin's own son. Juan Pablo Escobar today, known as Sebastián Marroquín, has publicly and repeatedly maintained that his father committed suicide. According to him, Escobar always said that if he found himself cornered, he would shoot himself in the head, just behind the ear, to avoid being captured alive and tortured by his enemies. To this theory, disturbing revelations were added. A former cartel member claimed that Los Pepes had offered money to the search block to collaborate in Escobar's elimination. For years, that accusation was considered mere speculation, until, in 2008, declassified CIA documents confirmed the existence of contacts between high-ranking officials of the Colombian National Police and leaders of the Vigilante group. One of the names appearing in the reports is that of General Miguel Antonio Gómez, then director of the police. According to the documents, he had allegedly shared key information with Los Pepes, indirectly contributing to Escobar's location. For some, these revelations suggest that he was executed by a clandestine alliance between state forces and paramilitary groups. For others, he simply took his own life before being caught. Sebastián Marroquín, Pablo Escobar's son, has insisted for years on a personal and dramatic explanation. He believes his father took his own life, not only out of pride, but also to protect his family. According to his account, Pablo was convinced that his enemies would not be satisfied with capturing him. They would go after his wife, his children, and anyone who bore his surname. He claims that during their last visit together, Pablo cried, as if he knew there would be no next meeting. For him, that farewell was definitive. The versions about his death still divide opinions, but there is one fact that no one doubts. A bullet pierced his skull behind the ear. A shot that, whether by his own hand or another's, put an end to the reign of the most feared drug trafficker in Colombia's history. His body was buried on the 3rd of December 1993, just 2 days after his birthday and 1 day after his death. The burial was more than a funeral ceremony. It was the last act of a figure who left a mark as deep as it was contradictory. At the cemetery, thousands awaited him. The event turned into a chaotic, emotional, and overwhelming scene. Some came to weep. Others, simply to confirm that the man who defied the state was finally underground. While a service reserved for family and close friends was held in the chapel, the streets of Medellín were flooded with a crowd estimated at more than 25,000 people. Some wore t-shirts with Escobar's face. Others raised banners proclaiming him their hero. For them, he was still the Robin Hood who defied the powerful. The moment the coffin was taken out of the funeral home marked the climax. The crowd, overwhelmed by emotion, rushed toward the casket to touch it. Chaos erupted. The police, stationed in the area, tried to contain the scene, but it was useless. The barriers gave way, and the situation became uncontrollable. The situation quickly exceeded the response capacity. The police had to reinforce the area with barricades and checkpoints. The fear of reprisals from the few active cartel members still present in Medellín was real, and the state did not want to take risks during such a tense event. The funeral procession moved toward the Jardins Montesacro cemetery. The crowd did not disperse. On the contrary, they followed the coffin as if it were a religious procession. But as the casket approached its final destination, the atmosphere became more hostile. Among the attendees were also those who deeply hated Escobar. Some shouted, others verbally assaulted his family, and there were even attempts at physical attacks. The tension reached such a point that, during the brief ceremony, the priest was unable to complete the prayer. The noise and confrontations among attendees made it impossible. That day, the cemetery became a stage of extreme contradictions. Weeping and celebration, respect and fury, silence and chaos. The figure of Escobar, even in death, continued to divide Colombia. Among those present was then President Cesar Gaviria. Although he had been the main promoter of the operation that culminated in the kingpin's death, he attended to show respect to the family of the deceased, a gesture that many interpreted as a symbol of the closing of an era. Because beyond the body buried that day, what was ending was an era. Medellin, and the entire country, were experiencing the end of the dominance of the most powerful cartel in recent history. During the previous months, the group had already begun to crumble. Government pressure, internal violence, and the constant harassment of Los Pepes, a paramilitary organization dedicated to destroying Escobar's legacy, had weakened its foundations. After the death of its leader, the collapse was inevitable. The lieutenants were captured, pursued, or executed one by one. No one was left to take command. The structure that Escobar had built with blood and dollars came crashing down. The fall of the Medellin cartel did not mean the end of drug trafficking in Colombia. It only opened space for other groups to take its place. The Cali cartel was the first to capitalize on that vacuum, and during the following years controlled much of the international cocaine trade. But its reign was also short-lived. By the mid-1990, the Colombian government dismantled its structure. Meanwhile, Escobar's family faced their own hell. Despite everything he had done, Pablo Escobar was still, for his son Juan Pablo, a father. And that family dimension is what supports his theory that his father took his own life not only to avoid the humiliation of being captured, but also to protect them. However, his death did not bring peace to his loved ones. On the contrary, it left them exposed. In 1995, his widow, Maria Victoria Henao, was forced to flee Colombia with her 2 children. They traveled through several countries in search of asylum, but encountered systematic rejection. The shadow of Pablo Escobar pursued them at every border. During that exile, the Cali cartel Escobar's sworn enemy demanded financial compensation from the family, claiming that Pablo had declared war on them. Maria, fearing for her son's life, accepted the conditions. She paid what they demanded and promised not to seek revenge, nor allow Juan Pablo to follow the same path as his father. For a time, they achieved some stability. Maria managed to reinvent herself as a real estate agent and maintain a low profile. But her past caught up with her again when a business partner discovered her true identity and disappeared with a considerable sum of money. The incident ended with her arrest. She spent 6 months in prison, while the authorities thoroughly investigated her financial activities. She was eventually released. No evidence of illegal activity was found. Her business was legitimate. Since then, the Escobar family has tried to live normally. But that surname associated with violence, power, and death has been a constant burden. No matter how hard they try, escaping Pablo Escobar's legacy has not been easy. Over time, Sebastián Marroquín Pablo Escobar's son decided to narrate his version of the events. He did so through a book titled Pablo Escobar, My Father, in which he recounts not only the life of the kingpin, but also the devastating consequences that story left on his family. Far from disappearing into oblivion, Escobar's figure has remained alive in the collective imagination. Medellin, the city that was once a symbol of terror, with an average of 19 murders per day during the darkest years, has re-emerged as a tourist destination. And it has done so, in part, thanks to international fascination with the story of its most infamous resident. More and more visitors arrive, attracted by books, movies, and series such as Narcos, which have contributed to turning Escobar's story into a narrative of action, crime, and power. Many tourists seek to walk through the same settings where the drug lord built his empire: houses, hideouts, key points of his operation. In Medellin, there is even a museum installed in one of his former safe houses. There, personal objects are exhibited: his Mercedes-Benz riddled with bullet holes, fragments of airplanes used in smuggling operations, and furniture with secret compartments where he hid cash. The violence that marked the generation has, paradoxically, ended up enriching the city. Tourism, linked to the Escobar phenomenon, has become a source of income that stimulates the local economy. The famous Hacienda Nápoles, abandoned after his family's escape, also changed its function. Its exotic hippos left behind because they were too large to be confiscated, roamed free for years in the surrounding areas. Over time, those hippos turned into an uncontrolled population. Without natural predators and with abundant vegetation, they began to reproduce at an accelerated rate. They roamed freely through Antioquia in search of food, increasingly interacting with inhabited areas. By 2014, there were already more than 40 specimens living in the wild. Today, they are known as the cocaine hippos. Hacienda Nápoles also underwent its transformation. After years of abandonment, the Colombian state expropriated it under the asset forfeiture law and handed it over to low-income families. Over time, the land was converted into a theme park with attractions, a museum, and luxury hotels. An absolute irony. The heart of a drug lord's empire turned into a tourist destination and legal economic engine. Something similar happened with La Catedral, the private prison from which Escobar directed the cartel for a time. After his escape in 1992, the place remained abandoned for more than a decade, becoming a symbol of impunity and institutional decay. But in 2007, a group of Benedictine monks settled there. Far from the urban noise, they found in the site a suitable place for meditation. In a short time, they built a chapel, a library, a cafe, and a spiritual retreat house. They also hired local staff to keep the place functioning. Years later, the municipality of Envigado recognized the work of the monks and granted them full ownership of the place. Thus, the spaces that once represented power, fear, and control have been redefined, no longer as temples of crime, but as centers of reflection or tourist attractions. But that transformation has not erased the past. Pablo Escobar continues to be a figure that sparks fascination, rejection, and debate. His story as a criminal leader, his violent death, and the aftermath he left in Medellin and throughout Colombia remain the subject of analysis, documentaries, and discussions around the world. Beyond the myth, one undeniable fact remains. His legacy, for better or worse, has not disappeared. Escobar was not the only kingpin to leave an indelible mark, but few have transformed their surroundings so profoundly, only to later have their downfall become part of the national narrative. His figure has been reinterpreted, turned into cultural product, and recycled as part of historical tourism. The truth is that his shadow, despite the passage of time, continues to loom over the contemporary history of Latin America. Thank you for joining us in this documentary journey about one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century. If you found this content valuable, we invite you to leave a like and share it. That way we can continue creating serious and detailed research about the moments and figures that shape the world of crime and power. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos. And tell us in the comments, what do you think about Pablo Escobar's impact on Colombia's history? What other topics would you like us to cover? Your participation makes this project possible. See you in the next episode.